I love racing games. Ever since I was a kid, I dreamt of getting behind the wheel and flying down a drag strip at 200 miles an hour, or linking apex to apex as I speed around a racetrack. Now that I'm an adult, there's one slight problem. I don't fit in a race car, so I still rely on video games to feed that dream. But immersion is a key element. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a few simple tricks that you can use to help elevate your player's experience and make your racing game much more immersive. The FlyBy. Flybys, or commonly referred to as just bys or whooshes, are sounds that inanimate objects make as they fly past you, even though that object itself may make no sound. This could be anything from streetlights to road signs or even bridges. Last week, Dan Reynolds, senior technical sound designer at Epic Games, put out a great video showing an easy way to create a Doppler effect using effect chain presets. So we're going to take his tutorial and expand on it. Now, I don't want to take anything away from Dan's video, so I'm going to set up the Doppler shift fairly quickly. But if you'd like a more in-depth look, there will be a card that just popped up in the top right corner of your screen for his video, and you'll also find a link to it in the description below. So now that we have our Doppler shift set up, we need to create something to drive by. So I do already have a blueprints folder set up, and we're going to go ahead and right click and go to blueprint class, and we're going to make a blueprint actor. And I'm just going to call this BP underscore streetlight because I'm going to use a streetlight for it. And we'll go ahead and open that up. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a static mesh. And I can call this static mesh streetlight. I think the pack that I have from the marketplace, it's called lamppost v1. Perfect. So there is our street light that we're going to be driving by. And so the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to add a box collision. And you can name this whatever you want. Just name it box if you'd like. But this box collision is what we're going to use to trigger that audio of the flyby. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this up. So it's 25 by 25. And we can give it some height, you know, just in case as part of your game you have the player has the ability to jump or crash and roll or things like that. You want to make sure that there's enough vertical height for this to trigger too, because the player might not be on the road. And we'll go ahead and compile this and save it and move it out of the way for a second. Because now we're going to go into our audio folder, and I do already have a folder for flybys because I have a wind howling asset that I'm going to be using for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right click, and we're going to create a meta sound source. And I'm just going to call this MSS underscore flyby and open. Now, before we start building out the meta sound, there's a couple things that we want to do first. If you're working on a project that has sound classes, you'll definitely want to make sure that you're adding your sound class here. For this tutorial, I'm actually not using sound classes, so I'll leave that blank. For virtualization mode, we are going to switch restart to play when silent. We are going to use the on finish, so we don't need to worry about a bunch of these still playing while they're quiet. But once we get into utilizing the trigger boxes, this is going to help. If you keep it on restart, you may run into issues. So we'll keep that as play when silent. And we're going to come down to our source effects chain, and we're going to add that Doppler shift that we had created. And then we're going to come down here to our attenuation settings, and I don't have one created yet. we're going to go ahead and create a sound attenuation. And I do have a folder for attenuations though. And I'm just going to call this att_FlyBy. For right now, the default settings in that attenuation are going to be good enough for the tutorial, but you may find that you'll need to go in and make some adjustments, but they will work for what we're doing here. So now that we have all of our details set up, we can go ahead and start building out our meta sound. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a wave player. And since this is a spatial piece of audio, I'm just going to use the mono wave player here. And I'll go ahead and drag that wind howling asset that I already had. If you have a wind howling asset or wind in general, you can use it. You can also get creative and you can use white or pink noise for this. But I thought the wind howling had a nice sound to it. Now I am going to go ahead and set this to loop, even though we're not going to be utilizing the loop. This is more of a fail-safe just in case. And you'll see why in a second. Now, if we look at the asset that I have and we look at the duration, this is 286 seconds. So what I'm going to do to help give us some variation is I'm going to come off of our start time and we're going to get a random time. And I'm going to leave the minimum at 0. And for our max, I'm going to set this, say, at 250. This isn't something that you have to do. It's just something that I'm doing because I have a longer file. And like I said, this is going to help with variation. Since this could technically start anywhere on this audio timeline, that's just the amount of different variations that we're going to get is going to be a lot. You could also hook up your pitch shift and add even more variations, but I think for this example, just using the random time is going to be sufficient. And we'll go ahead and connect our on play. Now, when it comes to the other side of our wave player, I am going to move this on finished out of the way. And I'm actually going to do a mono mix 2. Not because we're going to be adding other elements to it, but it's just a really easy way to get to this gain value. And we'll go ahead and connect this, and that can run our out. And so now that we have access to this gain, we're going to set up a fade out. And you can create fades by doing an interp2. And run your target into a value node. And so inside of our value node, we want our initial value to be 1 and our target value to be 0. And we can do this over the course of, let's say, a half a second. So basically, when we trigger this set over 0.5 seconds, it's going to take the gain from this 1 down to 0. And that's what's going to create a fade. Now, it is a linear fade, but it's totally fine for what we're doing. And so now we need a way to set this. So I can go ahead and right click on this and promote to a graph input. And I'm just going to change the name of this real quick and we'll call it finished. You can name it whatever you want. It's just something that's easy to remember. And now we're going to go ahead and take our on finish. And since our interp time right now is 0.5, I'm going to do a trigger delay and we can call this 0.6 just so it has enough time to fully fade out. And then we're going to stop that meta sound. That way we don't have to worry about it continuously playing. And so now when we trigger it, we hear the wind. And if we trigger our finish, you can hear that it fades out and then stops, which is exactly what we want. I'll go ahead and save this. And now we're going to jump back over. And inside of our streetlight blueprint, we can go ahead and grab audio, and we can rename it. I'm going to call this FlyBy. And over here in our details panel, I did automatically pick up that wind sound because I had it selected in the content browser, but we can go ahead and change that to our FlyBy. And we'll just move this up just a hair. And now with our FlyBy select, over here in the details panel, we're going to search for auto activate and we're going to turn it off. And now we can compile and save, because we don't want this to constantly be running. We don't want it to be active when we don't want it to. So now we're going to come in here to our event graph and we can get rid of all of this. And we're going to use our box collision. So with our box collision selected, we can scroll down in the details and we're going to use both the on begin overlap and the on end overlap. And as you probably guessed, we're going to be using this box trigger to activate and end our meta sound. But we don't want to just connect this here and say enabled. We want to basically look at some determining factors on whether this audio piece should fire or not. And what we're going to be using to determine that is going to be the player speed, which means we have to find a way to get access to that information. And I'm using the vehicle template. And so the way that we do that with vehicle template is we're going to come out and we are going to cast to the wheeled vehicle pawn. Now, if you've created your own blueprint for your vehicle, or, say you're using something else, like maybe you want to do flybys in like a first or third person running, you'll cast to that the appropriate blueprint that you're using. But like I said, I'm using the vehicle template and this is what I need to cast to for that. And off of the object, I want to get the player pawn, and we can just tuck that under here so that it's nice and neat. And then as our wheeled vehicle pawn, we can pull off here and we are going to get our forward speed. And it is automatically going to tie it to this vehicle movement component. Now, if you're following along with this tutorial exactly as I'm doing it, I do want to mention that this float value that it spits out is not in miles per hour or kilometers. It's in units. The heads up display does some conversion. So we need to know what this raw output looks like. And so we can test this real quick. I'm just going to throw an event tick in here. And we'll run that to a print string and our return value. It's going to auto convert. We're going to be getting rid of this, but I just want to show you real quick. We move this out of the way and this out of the way. You can see that I do already have a long stretch of road set up here. So let's head down. We'll drag in blueprint that we created for our. And we'll go ahead and hit play. And so now over on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see a bunch of numbers. And that is our print string spitting out our current forward speed. But you will notice as I move forward, nothing happens until we hit that trigger box. And so now you want to find a good speed that you feel that flyby should happen. So we'll say about 120 kilometers an hour. And looking over at the numbers from our print string, seems to be about 33 to 3,400. Don't worry about these errors. The only reason that those errors are popping up is because it was trying to pull forward speed before we hit that overlap, which returned a null value. So those errors were totally fine. And we can go ahead and delete this because now we know that at roughly 3,400 units is where we want that flyby sound to happen. So we can go ahead and move this down a little bit. And off of this return value, we want a greater or equal. And we can go ahead and plug that 3,400 in there. And so what this node is going to do is if this value is equal or greater than 3,400, it's going to spit out a value of true. Anything else is going to be false. We're going to run this into a branch. And we can connect this execute pin off of our cast. And what that's going to do then is when the player hits that collision box, it's basically going to do a speed check. Now off of our false, that means our speed is lower than that 3,400. We don't want to do anything, so we can leave that alone. But for our true, we'll go ahead and grab a reference to our flyby. And now we're going to activate it. And so now this audio asset will only play if the player is going fast enough to trigger it. And then we can come back over here to our end overlap. I will grab another reference to that meta sound. And since we set up a trigger for our finish, which is going to fade it out and then stop that meta sound, this right here, we can go ahead and grab this, plug it into here. And now that way, when the player exits that box collision, it'll go ahead and close out that meta sound. So we don't have to worry about it just playing or taking up a voice while it's silent. And we'll go ahead and compile that, save it. And so let's jump back over to our viewport. And I am going to move this far enough away that we can actually hit our target speed. And we'll go ahead and hit play. Take off. And I'm going to keep it under that 120 where we know it will not fire, just to test it. And as you can hear, there was no flyby sound. Now, let's try to get up to speed as we zoom past that street. And as you heard, we now have that flyby. It is attenuated because we have the attenuation on it. And you can play with some of these settings. You can play with the attenuation volume. You can play with, go into our effects. You can change the speed of sound, which I do currently have at 700. By default, it's 343, and that does make the sound a little weird when we drive by it. Makes it very quick. So that didn't quite sound right. So if you need to adjust this value, you certainly can. Obviously, 343 meters per second is the real life speed of sound, but this is a video game. And so I'm going to set that back to 700. I've played around with this value quite a bit. 700 kind of seems to be the sweet spot. And we can keep testing this even more. Now that we have quite a few of these set up, go ahead and hit play again. And I'll start under that 120 kilometer an hour mark. And as you can hear, we don't hear anything, but if we speed up, now you can hear that once we cross that speed threshold, we started to hear those flybys. And like I said, you can play with all the different settings to get it sounding the way that you want. I really just wanted to show you the mechanical setup of it. And now let's move on to our next section, ambient wind speed. Ambient wind is another way to give your players a sense of speed. Similarly to flybys, this is the sound of wind rushing past an object. But now that object is your vehicle. So instead of it zooming past, you're along for the ride. So we have to ask ourselves, what would a whoosh sound like from the perspective of the thing that's making it? Spoiler alert, it sounds like wind. And since we know that it's going to sound like wind, we're going to need another wind asset, which I do already have. And so we're going to go ahead and create another meta sound. And we'll call this MSS underscore ambient wind. And we'll go ahead and open. Now, like before, if you are using sound classes, please feel free to add your sound class here. As for the rest of this, restart is totally fine on the virtualization mode. We don't need anything in our source effects chain because we're not going to be using the Doppler shift on this. And we don't need any attenuation settings because this sound is going to follow us. And because this is a perpetual sound, we can go ahead and get rid of our one-shot interface. And we'll go ahead and get another wave player. Now, this is totally acceptable to use a stereo wave player for this. That will kind of help add to the immersion. Otherwise, you're just going to have a wind sound coming from your center channel, and you want the wind to sound like it's rushing past you on both sides. So we are going to use a stereo wave player. We do want this to loop, and we can go ahead and put that ambient wind asset right there in our wave player. Go ahead and connect our on play. And off of this side, just like we had for our flybys, I will set this to stereo real quick. We're not going to be adding layers to it. You certainly can if you want to, but we're not in this example. But I do still want access to this gain value. And so I'll just go ahead and these real quick. But this time, off of our gain, I can simply make this a graph. Because what we want to be able to do, we want to be able to control how much of this volume is being played. Now, I do want the default value saved as 0. But we don't need this to be a knob. And I'm just going to change this to wind volume. Or I guess just to be correct, we can call this wind gain. And that's pretty much all we need for this. We'll clean it up a little and make it look nice. And so now we just simply need to set up the controls for it. And we're going to do that in the vehicle blueprint itself. I'm going to go ahead and open up my sports car pawn. Again, yours might be different if you're doing this on a self-created vehicle, or you're using like a first or third person character. But since I'm using the vehicle template, we're going to go ahead and open up this sports car, and we want to be in the event graph. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add an audio component that is going to be our MSS underscore ambient wind. And this now is totally fine if it is set to auto activate. In fact, that is what we want. We want this meta sound to always be active. So by leaving that as auto activated, it will automatically activate once the vehicle spawns. Now, since we're already in the sports car blueprint, we don't need to do any cast to. We already have access to our vehicle movement component. And from here, we can go ahead and get our forward speed again. And so you can probably see where we're going with this. With this input here, we're going to be using the vehicle speed to control the wind gain. And so we'll go ahead and grab a reference to our audio and set our float parameter. And we can just go ahead and copy this directly from the input. That way we know that everything is character correct, there aren't any typos. And we need a way to trigger this. Now, I know that some people are very against doing this, but I am going to use the event tick. So every frame, it is going to update our float parameter. Now, as you saw earlier, we're getting up into the thousands off of this. And so we don't want to plug this directly into here. Otherwise, it's going to take that volume incredibly high. Meta sounds won't let it go that high, but you can see why this would be bad. And so the way that we're going to get around this is by pulling off of here. And we're going to do a map range, and we specifically want clamped. Now, since this is expecting a value between 0 and 1, that's what we want our out range to be. And our in range is going to be where we set what speed is going to trigger this. And so just to throw some arbitrary numbers in here, I'm going to say that anything between 2,500 and 5,000 is going to get mapped 0 to 1. Anything below this speed, we'll keep it at 0, which means we're not moving fast enough to hear the sound. And if we happen to go over this speed, it also doesn't matter because we will already be at a value. And we can go ahead and plug that. If you do happen to have a more performant way to do this other than using event tick, please let me know in the comments. But for the sake of the tutorial, this is what. And so we can go ahead and compile that, save it. And so now every tick, it's going to be checking on whether this speed is below 2,500, if it's within this range, or if it's above 5,000. And if it is between this range, it will gradually increase the volume of that wind speed until it reaches its max gain of 1. I'll go ahead and everything, and we can move this away because that is all we need to do for that. So I'll go ahead and start. And so you can hear, as we got faster, the volume of that wind came up. And as we slow back down, you will hear that wind fade back out. And since that one was fairly quick, let's move on to the next one. Motion blur. Now, if you've been following along so far, you should already have this set up. If you're just here for the motion blur stuff, you will have to get your movement component and your forward speed. But since we already have that, we're just going to use what we have here. Now, for motion blur, I will say that if you have a post-processing volume inside of your level already, that will override anything that we're about to do. So I am currently doing this without a post-processing volume in this level. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to use the back camera, but you can do this to either or both. And with my back camera selected, I'm going to come over here to details and I'm going to look for blur, and I'm going to turn on the motion blur here. And I'm going to start with my value at 0. And so we're going to go ahead and get a reference to this camera. And we're going to right click and get a make post process setting. Now this node by default doesn't have any pins. And when you click on it, you can see over here in the details all of the different pins that you can possibly have. And so I'm going to specifically look for blur and the amount. Now, if you'd like, you're more than welcome to use a different map range for this, but I'm going to use this one since it's already hooked up to our ambient wind. I'm going to make that motion blur coincide with that wind sound. And so I can actually drag off here and just go straight into our make post process setting. And so now when the player is between 2,500 and 5,000, it will adjust this amount from 0 to 1. And so off of our camera, go ahead and here, and we're going to set our post process settings. We can go ahead and plug this right into here. And since we're already using the event tick to set our wind speed gain, I can just go ahead and pass that execute directly onto here. And we can compile it and save it. And that's actually all we need to do. So if I move this out of the way, play. I will forewarn you, the tires on this particular vehicle are terrible with motion blur. But we're going to go ahead and speed up. As we cross that threshold, you'll see that motion blur start to happen. But more importantly, you're going to notice it on the street lights. So you can see how there is motion blur as they zoom past. If I were to disable this real quick, just to kind of give you a comparison of what those streetlights look like without motion blur, you can see that they are very choppy. I'm getting some V-Sync issues with them, and they look very jagged and not rendered in correctly. We'll go ahead and connect that motion blur, and I'll show you again just one. You can see the terrible motion blur on the tires, but now we don't see that V-Sync chopping and artifacting on those streetlights. They do look like they're actually blurring past us. So very simple to set up, very impactful on the player. F.O.V. F.O.V, or field of view, refers to how wide of an angle you can see. Adjusting this value in real time can have a subconscious effect on the sense of speed your player is feeling. Increasing the field of view over time creates a fisheye lens effect and will make your player feel like they're moving faster than they actually are. Now this is going to be another very quick setup. By default, the camera, our current field of view is set to 90, which looks like this. And if we were to increase this all the way up, hit play, you can see the difference. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to get another map range clamped because I do want different values out of our out. So we're still going to use our speed. But now instead of 0 to 1, like I mentioned, default is 90. And that's totally fine. If you do have like menu options and stuff that change this, you can route that in there to make sure that it adjusts accordingly. And for right now, let's just call this 110. So it's only going to increase by 20 degrees our field of view. We're going to come out of our camera and we're going to set field of view. Don't need the extra one. And now we can just route it directly in here and we can continue our execute chain. That's it. That's all we need to do for that. I will make this look a little nicer. And we can compile it and save it. That's it for adjusting the field of view. So I'll go ahead and hit play. And as we hit that threshold, you'll see our motion blur happening. You hear our wind come in, and you can see that field of view adjustment. Go ahead and slow back down, and you can see the camera field of view now returning back to normal. And you can certainly play with these settings too. Like say maybe you wanted to start at 1500 and maybe want to get really crazy with this. We can crank this up to say 150. Now, if we hit F.O.V is going to start changing sooner and it's going to be way more drastic. Camera offset. So for this last one, this is actually the easiest of them all, and I'm actually going to show you two different ways to do this. So the first way I'm going to show you, we actually don't even have to do anything in our event graph because camera offset is actually something that is by default part of the spring arms. So if we click on the spring arm and we come over here, we can scroll down and we're looking for the lag category. Now by default, enable camera lag is turned off. We're going to turn it on. And by default, yours is probably set to 50. I've already been playing with this one, so I've set mine to 250. And just to make sure that you can see this effect, I'm going to go ahead and enable our field of view, file it. So if I hit play, you'll see as we accelerate, now that camera is moving back, or rather the car is moving forward away from the camera. And then as we slow down, you'll see that that spring arm now retracts and we're back to our default position. Now I should warn you that using the camera lag or the spring arm lag does also mean that this works in reverse. So if we back up, the car now gets closer to the camera, and that may not be what you want. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and untick this box. So we're going to disable the camera lag. And instead, what we're going to do is we are going to set relative location. Camera here. Set location. And we do want this to move on our tick that we're already using. And so what we want to do is under new location, we want to go ahead and right click on here and we want to split the struct pins. And we're going to need another map range clamped. I'll go ahead and copy and paste that down here. And since I want this to start as soon as the player starts accelerating, I'm going to set our in range A to 0. And then we can set our in range B to something else. So I'm going to call this 2500. And for our outrange now, we do want to work in negative values. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call this negative 200. And we can run this into our new location, X. We'll go ahead and compile that, save it. And so now when I hit play, you'll see that we get that same camera offset that we did while using the camera lag for the spring arm. But now, if we go into reverse, nothing happens. And the reason that nothing happens is because we're getting the forward speed, which means these are all positive values if we're moving forward. But if we go in reverse, they're negative. And so since we're using a map range clamped, the value coming in is lower than 0, which means our outrange is going to stay as 0. And so you can use this with field of view, or you can use it in place of. It's entirely up to you, but when combined, now we're going to have our offset, and now we're going to get into that field of view change, and now the player is just cruising. All right, guys, so that's going to wrap things up for this video, and I do apologize that it's been so long since my last one. As you can tell, I'm in a new studio. My wife and I recently bought a house, and I'm still in the process of getting the new space set up. But once I've finished, uploads will get back to normal. So if you'd like to see more, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the notification bell so you never miss out on any future content. And if you'd like to be a part of the Sound Effects Guy Discord server, you'll find a link in the description below. Until next time.